One of ARMY's professional learning clusters is the Art and Science of Thinking. The Cove and Cove Plus have lots of resources to help you learn, organise your thoughts and make better decisions. Cove Plus currently offers 17 self-paced units on a Dell, which you can access right now to help improve your own thinking. Today's speaker has authored some of those modules. Queensland University's Dr. Tony Peloso. Dr. Peloso is an educator in corporate education within QUT's Faculty of Business. In this role, he teaches strategic thinking, strategy implementation, innovation, and marketing. He has strong expertise in strategic thinking, business planning, innovation, creative processes, and leadership development. He has also taught undergraduate, postgraduate, and MBA classes at QUT and Arizona State University. Dr. Peloso, thanks so much for your time and joining us today on the Cove.
Thank you. And Captain Jenkins, thank you so much. And I honour you for your commitment to capability development in the Australian Army. So welcome today, everybody, and thank you very much for your attention. And today, as Captain Jenkins said, we want to speak about better thinking and how we can actually put that in place. And these key topics really are stages of better thinking, tools and tips for better thinking, sense making, and also we'll take questions and insights from you at the end of the presentation today. Now, a few things that I want to put in place as we get started today. And my thinking is that better decisions lead to better outcomes and stronger teams. So it's a fundamental element of what I'd like to share with you today. And here's a statement from one of the great thinkers of the 20th century who really focused on complexity thinking and challenges, particularly in theatres of war in which you are engaged. And he makes this statement: the only thing harder than starting something new is stopping something old. And what's critical to think about here is that not only do we have to know what to keep of the existing, or as in Professor Ackoff's mindset, something old, but what it is that we need to keep, what do we need to change, and how do we put in the elements and steps in place to actually move forward with that change. Something else I want to speak to you quite critically, and another professor, Carl Weick, talks about, is this concept of high reliability organizations. You work in a high reliability organization, and much of my work and QUT's work is also working in this context. And these are organizations that are able to do a few absolutely critical things. This ability to induce a rich awareness of discriminatory detail, know what's going on around them, and look for nuances, and also, importantly, a capacity for action. So what does this mean, and what do we actually do next? Now, a tiny bit more about high reliability organizations. These are organizations where the risks are high, their failure and errors can be catastrophic. Now, these are very often highly unlikely, but when they happen, can be critically important and, in fact, very dangerous. And Professor Weick has these 5 critical elements that he addresses. And he says that high reliability organizations have a preoccupation with failure. What can go wrong? They have a reluctance to simplify. So we're incredibly well trained, but we still need to keep a focus on the big picture. Sensitivity to operations. We know what's going on around us. We know what we need to do, and we stay focused on that. A commitment to resilience. We are people in your organization who need to get up every day and focus on the absolute crucial mission. And another piece that I think is absolutely essential, and it's very interesting, and there's almost a conundrum here, and this is deference to expertise. Now, this is not about hierarchy within your organization. This is about knowing who knows what and when to exercise that capability or that knowledge. So these are some of the critical, powerful elements of high-performing, high-reliability organizations. Now, 2 professors at Stanford talk about this concept of the knowing-doing gap. And what they're saying is that we need to be very aware of what we know, very aware of what we don't know, and also be extremely conscious about what we're going to do in particular situations with that knowledge. And the gap is when we're actually unsure of what we know and unsure of what we need to do about it. So let's keep that in context as we go. And a final thing that's absolutely critical is that we've got to remember that you work in teams. Teams are actually social systems, and it's a community. And there's something extraordinarily powerful about this. And at the same time, we need to maintain this and honor it and be consciously aware of that. So very much today, part of our conversation about better thinking is how we do better thinking, not just ourselves, but how we do this in teams. And we maintain this social system and this community to deliver the outcomes that we need to achieve. Now let's have a conversation about this 4 stages of better thinking. You work in a relationship and connection situation, absolutely critical. And I'm going to use this metaphor of reading the room and be thinking about what's in the room, what's outside the room, what we know about what's in the room, and what we don't know about what's in the room. The concept of knowing and awareness, now they're related, but they're not the same thing. And I'll speak about that in terms of people, things, places, and events. And finally, process and patterns. Patterns are absolutely crucial to what you do. Understanding the patterns, and seeing changes in patterns. And finally, pulling this together in terms of context. So let's have a conversation here about knowing and awareness. The simple fact is that we're sentient creatures and our senses are constantly working even when we're asleep. We still are a thinking, sentient individuals. And what does this mean? And you put that in the context of a team and it makes it even more complex and complicated. So let's simplify this a little bit. Let's imagine going into a coffee shop and clearly all of our senses are active. We can feel things, we can see things, if you're a coffee drinker, the incredible aroma, the taste, there might be music, the sound of coffee beans being ground, all of those things that are happening. And clearly in your context, put that in the context of a high reliability organization. And these are actually accentuated. And we need to bring all of these into our thinking processes. That's all very well. Now, a very famous statistician, Nate Silver, who is one of these people who can predict the unpredictable to some degree, never perfect, but quite powerful. And he has 3 critical statements to make about prediction. And he says that we believe that the past typically predicts the future. But he wants us to be very aware of this idea that extrapolation without consequence can be incredibly dangerous. And he goes on to say that signals, or cues, as we might call it in my context, literally are about correlation, not causation. In other words, if we get a signal, we cannot assume what the consequence of that is actually going to be. We need to be aware that a signal might be associated with often what the outcome might be, but it's not going to cause an outcome. And finally, Nate Silver talks a lot about noise and this crucial element of we need to be literally sentiently aware of sounds around us, both literal and metaphysical. And remember that we're also listening for what's missing, what's not happening, what can we not hear that we want to be hearing, what's unfamiliar, and also what are any noises that we have that are improbable and that might be suggesting something else that literally might happen that we don't know about or we might be able to predict. Now, we are problem solvers. As human beings, we spend our days creating hypotheses and sense testing those hypotheses. What's the traffic going to be like today? Which is the best way to get there? Who am I going to run into? What's going to happen? So we're constantly thinking about what's working. How do I deal with this situation? What's the best way that I can go about solving particular challenges? This is our daily existence. Put this into your context, it becomes more complex, many more factors and variables at play here. So I want to speak to you about the idea of sense testing oneself thinking and the thinking of your team, and posit constantly this what if question, sense testing our thoughts. What am I thinking? What are we thinking in our team? And what does this actually mean? Back to our initial definition, I spoke about discriminatory detail. And what are we looking for? What do we want to be aware of here? And I'm going to, and this can be quite contentious, and I sometimes get myself into very interesting conversations. I'm a huge fan of the concept of creating hunches. Now, a hunch is that moment that you get where you're wondering, what might this mean? What are the possibilities? And I would call this nuance in the situation when we're under pressure, we're very time sensitive, and that we're in a situation of challenge. So if we make assumptions, as powerful as they are, often, sometimes, that can introduce potential bias, because what we're thinking about is proving or disproving what our assumption is, rather than thinking of the bigger picture. Experiments are incredibly powerful, but in an experiment, we actually exclude variables, so we might miss something. A review, after action reviews, retrospectives, root cause analyses, amazing things. In context, however, under time pressure, they really are time rich. It can be an incredible challenge. And finally, analysis is powerful, but it leads to cognitive overload, which can often be exhausting. So we need to be thoughtful about our hunches. I just want you to take a moment to look at this amazing scene. Brisbane River, mangroves growing here. And if you look incredibly closely, there are two birds here, incredibly well camouflaged. They're practicing hypervigilance, they're practicing intuition, and they're basically using their sixth sense, which is what we encourage you to do. So as well as feeding and bathing, they're actually constantly checking the surrounds of their particular context. Very powerful, great metaphor, I believe. Now, ultimately, you're in the relationship and connection business. Essential for you to be very aware of this. So let's spend a little time speaking more about people. And in this empathy map, something that we use in our work all the time, including in the defense space, we're going to ignore the pain gain here at the moment, and we're going to focus on this element. And we put ourselves in the first person. I did a wonderful piece of work with bus drivers as we tried to understand the complexity of their lives. Again, they work in a high reliability situation. So we work with these bus drivers, imagining sitting in their seat. And we were asking them to speak in the first person and second person about what are they thinking and feeling when this is taking place? What can they hear happening around them? What can I see as a bus driver when I'm sitting there? What do I say and do? And this way we can build a live picture of what's happening literally in context and deeply understand. And in your situations, you want to be able to understand what this individual or group or team is thinking. And remember that you also have opponents. You're in the theater of war. So what are our opponents thinking and doing here? This is the analysis. That's something that we leave for later. This is a powerful approach, I believe, to being able to deal with difference and conflict and different opinions. We don't, groupthink can be the enemy of better thinking. So I call it a conversation square. And there are 4 elements: move, follow, oppose, and bystand. Let's chat a little bit more about this. So to get a conversation started, someone has to be brave enough to actually start the conversation. So you need to name it. So move is a crucial element of what's going to happen. Someone then needs to do confirmation. Yes, I understand. Yes, we've seen this before. Yes, we know what it's about. Crucial stage of this. Someone then has to comfortably but seriously pose a challenge. Let's be cautious about this. Remember the time that something different happened. So the challenge, this opposed piece, is crucial. And then we need a bystand. We can't get lost in this conversation. We need to move on. Now, just for a little bit of fun here, a couple of images. So just the idea that we need to be moving forwards. We need to move and confirm. We also want the idea of we're working collaboratively together. In the neighborhood where everyone loves an image of a cat. This cat literally sits outside of one of the unit blocks. And to me, that's the perfect example of bystand. There's no judgment. It's just a reminder of, okay, let's see where we are and let's move on. And finally, what's the point of this? We need to move on to an action stance. What are we going to do? What's my role in this conversation square? Who is going to step forward? And if no one else does, how do I do this? So what's my role? And where are we in this conversation? And this brings better thinking absolutely to the fore. Now, here's a crucial element, and in organizations like yours, we need to be very, very conscious of this. So there's a difference between a hierarchy and a heterarchy. Now, hierarchy, clearly we have layers of organizational decision-making in particular. Now, I'm not saying that that's good or bad. We have incredible structure and rigor in hierarchies. At the same time, in certain situations where we're time poor and it's high risk and we're under pressure, we need this different kind of thinking. We need this network thinking. And if you remember back to Carl Weick's statement about deference to expertise, absolutely critical. It comes into play here. And at the same time, we're working in this system of interconnectedness. So back to our metaphor of reading the room. Here are 3 images of exactly the same room from a different perspective. And just by the way, there's this great book by Cantor called Reading the Room. It has some amazing techniques in it that you might want to follow up on. So here we are in an art gallery, exactly the same room from very different perspectives. And each one of these tells a different story. And oh, by the way, this amazing concept of the power of small things. Small things can be completely dangerous and can also be incredibly powerful for us. So Carl Weick studies disasters. So wildfires, as Americans would call them, ferry accidents, aeroplane accidents, all sorts of other disasters. And so often a fire will be started by a piece of glass or a cigarette butt, or a disaster might happen. Someone trips over a cord that's in the wrong place. So that's the negative side of small things. And the positive side of small things is that someone saying the right thing at the right moment can just start this upward spiral of good behavior and also of great outcomes. Now, one of the things that I also wanted to talk about was place, and we want to recognize where we are, literally, physically. One of the things we talk about at the graduate school at QUT is this concept of a problem walk around. And it's walk and look at the situation. And the crucial element of this is without judgment. We're not judging what's happening around us. We're absolutely observing. It's a technique that comes from Toyota Motors. It's been used incredibly powerfully. And there are times when we just need to step out of what we're thinking and doing and just observe, no judgment. And that links back to our concept of a hunch. How do we have conversations about things that have gone wrong? Preoccupation with failure was one of the concepts that we mentioned. And it's a challenging thing. We don't want to talk necessarily about failure. That brings a different kind of emotion, but we need to address them. And perhaps error-friendly learning is something thoughtful and useful to talk about, and a way to let's have an error-friendly learning conversation about a context. And it really helps to build trust. Incredibly powerful approach, a thinking approach. We do need to structure this. So I love the concept of a peer-to-peer conversation. And how does this work? So we literally have a semi-structured process. We work with a template. And at any stage, we can actually choose the question that's right at that moment to have. And we do this without judgment. We simply observe. Now, the dynamic of this, peer-to-peer, 2 people, and one person is, so you, I'm asking you questions, and I'm using my template, and I'm just asking the questions that I think are relevant at that moment. And I pause and listen. And the power of this is then we swap, and then we repeat the conversation, but from the other part dynamic of that particular dyad. And that helps us get away from the concept of hierarchy to a concept of equality. So we're sharing about something, about a context. I also want to speak to you about patterns. So we look at this maze and we can see multiple things, but critically there are 2 elements. There's shadow and there's green. Space and something tangible. And depending on which way we look at this, we see different things. And we need to be able to change the way that we think about things. And to change patterns, we often need to change the image that we share of that particular pattern. Another concept here. Now, in teams, we need to be both together, but we also need to be able to call out difference. And this concept of the close, the many, and the powerful can come into play. And it's a wonderful way to have a conversation to inspire better thinking. So the close, these are the people closest to us, our immediate team. We like to huddle together. We like consensus happening here. Can be powerful, can also be destructive. We also like as humans to be like many around us. So everybody thinks this, we might like to say. And at the same time, we acknowledge the powerful. So the upside of this is that we can have consensus. We can actually understand that it's shared thinking, and that we also have someone who's an acknowledged leader in this situation. We also need to know when that isn't working for us, and to be aware that we're actually overemphasizing any of these particular elements in our thinking process. All right, now why does that actually matter? Here's a critical element of human thinking. When we don't know enough information, we just make stuff up because we like harmony rather than discord. Now, how dangerous is this for you? And we need to be aware enough, and we need to be conscious enough and brave enough to say something when we don't know enough. And we need to have those tools and processes around us to be able to find out stuff that we don't actually know. Now I want to move on to the next stage and give you some more tips and tools for better thinking. So these are some how-to process, things that you can put into your everyday professional lives and also your personal lives. So the next story is a story that we call Hearts and Minds. And literally, this is about knowing, and it's about knowing how other people think, make decisions, how your teams make decisions, and how your enemies make decisions. It's a very thoughtful way. So deep down, we call this cognition, affect, and intent. So it's built on of many years of psychological study. There are much more complex models, but to me, in your context, this works beautifully. So it's a three-component attitude formation model. And the three components are cognition, affect, and conation. We'll chat a little bit more about these three pieces. So cognition is logic. This is making a rational appeal. And for everybody, and for some more than others, this is the key driver of our thinking and of our attitudes and our potential behavior. Affect or emotion are incredibly powerful elements of human intent and human behavior. And finally, the willingness to, or the likelihood of acting or not acting, so this intent or conation, are absolutely crucial to eventually action. And that is all very well. In your context, meaning and purpose is also absolutely critical and crucial. So what's happening around us, this context and purpose, is also going to have a significant impact on the likelihood of the kind of action and outcome that we want. So if we stay focused on all of these elements when we're trying to drive behavior, be aware of our own behavior, our own why, and also those around us, incredibly powerful. Link this with your empathy mapping process. It gives you deep insight into your own thinking processes, those around you, and also those in the bigger picture environment. Here's to me, one of the foundation thinking. It's part of the element that makes Australia what it is. It helps form our national character. So Anzac Day, an amazing moment in the lives of Australians, and we're honoured for this around the world. And if you put those three elements together, so what's the logic of this happen? Why do we do this? What's the emotional element that this actually drives us as a nation? And other nations look at us and they actually honor us, and they're deeply aware of this. And at the same time, there's an intent to this. Why do we actually do this? For the protection of our nation in the future. And at the same time, the context is important. What's your organization's mission, and how do we honor that? Now let's move to how we leverage this. There's this concept of a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle. And in indirect terms, a virtuous cycle is an upward loop. It's a race to the top. A downward loop, we might call a vicious cycle, is a race to the bottom. Each of these can be inspired by a small thing, and the outcome is absolutely devastating or incredibly powerful. So let's just be thinking about how in a team we actually keep this upward loop happening. We've already discussed some of the tools and processes that we might actually use to keep us focused here. And we also need to be aware of discriminatory detail when something goes awry and we start this downward loop, and someone has to be brave enough to call it and actually help us recover. Since you operate in a theatre of war potentially as well, in our teams we want to be in this upward loop. And in the era of disinformation and misinformation and deterrence, we probably want to put our opponents into this downward loop. So it's a psychological game that we can play. But in our context, we want to be, as our team, in this upward loop or virtuous loop mindset and model. How do we do this? The concept of psychological safety is absolutely crucial. And I'm going to read this because this is critical. Psychological safety describes a team climate where people feel highly confident to speak up and voice their opinions, thoughts, and questions without feeling any personal risk to themselves. Now, that is an absolutely ideal state. And if we can be in that state and believe that we can be very clear about that discriminatory detail and call things, it has the most amazing impact and influence on our teams and trust. And we know that good decisions also result in action. So we want to be very thoughtful about this entire process. Let's just take a step back. I'm not a rock climber. There are many people around in Brisbane who are rock climbers. I'm coming from Brisbane at the moment. And this is the most powerful sense in some ways of psychological safety. So we have a belayer who's standing below, and the rock climber is doing the risk taking, but has complete, absolute trust, feels complete psychological safety, or ought to, in this moment where this is happening. Now, we like to talk about this concept of high caring and high daring. So high caring is when that deep psychological safety that we experience and feel as a team. And that also allows us to safely take more daring steps, to be more forthright about the things that we say and the things that we actually do. So we always want to be playing in this high caring and high daring space. Let's think about the kind of work that we're doing, the kinds of decisions that we're making. So synthesis and analysis are related, but they're different things. So let's talk about the green triangle work. Green triangle work is when we're thinking about how we can create the future. What is possible? What can this be? How can we change our team? What are the possibilities that we have here? Blue circle work is focused on how we can make what we currently have better. And it's a very different mindset. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of behaving. And teams need to be in a different state. And the question in the middle, particularly for our leaders, is to help us decide what's the task at hand and which of these two mindsets, green triangle or blue circle work, are we doing. In green triangle work, we're synthesizing, we're creating. In blue circle work, we tend to be much more in the analytical mindset and analytical thinking. This can be much more rapid, and we need to keep it low risk. Blue circle work is often high risk. It's changing the way we do things. We need to be very thoughtful when we're in that space. And let's be creative. Children, if you have some paper and you have some pens, they'll just start chatting and playing and drawing. And as adults, we tend to lose that. We literally lose that confidence and that ability to play. We use this tool called the rich picture constantly in our work. We describe it and everyone says, I'm sorry, but I can't draw, or I feel silly, or fill in the blank, and they don't want to do it. However, put 4 people around a table, around a small square table, have a very, very important conversation, have a paper on the table and have pens, and the conversations just start, and people will, I promise, will start doodling, and we'll get from potentially a simple outcome or a simplistic understanding of a challenge or problem and really move on. I'm not going to tell you the context. This was an amazing piece of work that I was a part of. And what came out of this conversation, these people talking, was this absolute burst of, I don't trust you. And they're the sorts of things that you wouldn't normally have in a conversation, but this structured but also creative process. Another thing that's related to this is the difference between active thinking and what we like to call cognitive closure. Let's have a look at the difference between these. So active thinking, and rich pictures are a very explicit example of active thinking, creates new ways to do things, and it generates alternatives. This is the Boyatzis' model of intentional change. And in many ways, any change can be thought of in this context. And the idea here is that we think about either our ideal self, or we think about the team as an ideal, or we think about the project. How can this be exactly the best possibility? We look at where we currently are, so our real state. We look at our strengths and capabilities, and remember that deference to excellence, to expertise. And we look at gaps here, and we continue this model here. But the power of this is developing these trusting relationships. So this is the nature of those of creating an ideal or green triangle work. And the opposite of that, in many ways, is this cognitive closure, the desire amongst many of us to have a firm answer to a question and an aversion towards ambiguity. The closer we get to action, of course, we need to reduce uncertainty. But as we are thinking, we really need to be open to this other and address the concept of ambiguity. Finally, we get to how do we put in place processes to make this stick? How can we, as an individual and as a team and as an organization, learn these techniques and practice them and be very conscious of them, and also, quite frankly, making it rich and enticing, and be strongly motivated in what it is that we're doing. So we'll call this bringing it all together. Now, here is a model. We create an acronym and call it the SECI model. And there are 4 elements of the SECI model: socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. And the fundamental element is this piece here. We all have this incredibly strong tacit knowledge. We have a very strong way to think, and we have a very strong connection to action. And often that becomes a subconscious or an unconscious process. And that's powerful when it's actually focused on true powerful outcomes. So we have this tacit knowledge. And what's important as we grow our thinking, as we move towards better thinking, and as a team we engage in better thinking, we want to be able to capture this. We want to make it external. We want to understand it and see it and share it. So we want models of how we can actually organize this tacit knowledge and make it explicit, turn it into something that everybody knows. And importantly, we know who has it and where it is. When we're going to go on and create new ways of doing things and new ways of thinking better, we then need to be able to share this and also create literally new knowledge, a combination of new ways of thinking. And then, because we don't want to spend all of our time thinking, we need in those moments, those high risk moments, we need to be able to then act without thinking, but act well. So we want to internalize this. So we want to make this now tacit knowledge. This is the way as a team we actually work. And on we go and continue this loop of continuous learning, continuous improvement. So one of the things to remember about tacit knowledge is it's hard to unearth. It's nothing tangible. You can't necessarily see it. It's more challenging to transmit, and it can be incredibly difficult to store. Here are 3 groups of ways of thinking about this. So tacit knowledge. So what we know without thinking, crucial. Where is it and how is it? And how do we expose and lift this up? So here are 3 groups of individuals who are experts in doing this. So librarians are experts at storing knowledge, categorizing knowledge, and making it accessible. Consultants are experts at applying knowledge in particular contexts. And coaches are incredibly good and powerful at actually bringing knowledge up, making it shared knowledge, and then making it tacit behavior, tacit knowledge that we get on with and do. So the power of this is knowing who knows what, when, and where. And the final piece of today's conversation really is about stories. Stories are so powerful to share, and you work in an absolutely storied organization that has an amazing history, and it has amazing power to do what needs to be done and do that with pride. So how do we make stories absolutely tangible and powerful and rich? I get to work with many organizations who are in that high reliability organizational space. And I remember this lesson. So this is a resource organization. Start every single meeting or engagement with a conversation, a safety moment, if it might be today, or an innovation moment or a learning moment. And they have a series of stories and symbols that they talk about. Now, I didn't need to know what they were, but someone could say, that's like the snake story. And people would go, yes, I understand it. And then in particularly challenging and dangerous situations, they would say something like, now that's a wolf story. We need to be really cautious and really aware here. So they had taken this to the point even where not only were there were stories, but they'd actually created literally almost a mythology around it so that they could literally convey both the cognitive element, but the emotive element of this particular context that they needed to be aware of. And to me, that's a powerful example of learning, better thinking, and also making those tacit, deeply embedded ways of thinking and doing. Now that brings me to the end of my conversation today, and I'd like to welcome back Captain Jenkins, who is going to share some of your insights, and also I will take questions. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm quite honoured that I have been invited today to share time with you. Captain Jenkins.
All right, so first question. You spoke about failure-friendly environment and having peer-to-peer conversations. Is it any different? And do you have any tips for managers trying to create this environment where failing and learning is okay within the team?
Wow. Thank you. Well, I think one of the really powerful and important elements of this is that idea of deference to expertise. So sometimes we make the assumptions that our superiors are the ones who have the most expertise. They have leadership capability and they're leading teams. It doesn't mean that they need to know absolutely everything that they're doing. So the power of the peer-to-peer concept, and also making it semi-structured, is that we start taking away those organizational structures, and we're actually playing expertise to expertise. And I think then swapping roles gives both parties the ability to stand in the shoes of the other. And in fact, it's like an empathy map process as we progress. Thank you for that question.
All right. So, let me change modes. So leading on with that, actually, that's a really good segue. Thinking about your empathy mapping. Culturally, the organization's not really, there's a bit of a stigma towards empathy and those sorts of things. So how can we apply that more within our team environments?
Mm-hmm. A couple of things here. I was working with a different division of defense, and some of the individuals were incredibly large and incredibly powerful individuals. And this gentleman gave me a wonderful tip. I said, so Commander, you actually work with many young recruits, you work with women, you work in a space of diversity. How do you make this work? And he said, well, you can tell that I'm a very large person. And so he said, I always walk beside and don't face people. So it's always a walking conversation to start with, which takes away a lot of the physical power. So that's one physical element that I think we can find ways to deal with. The other piece is that if we make it a shared goal, so what is it that we're both and all of us trying to achieve, it immediately starts to take away. And if we ask questions literally about what's it like being in your situation, how do we feel in your situation? And sometimes, to make it even more abstract, we talk about someone else. So it's not about you and me. What would it be like for Tony, for example, if he were in this situation? So we both abstract it, and we take away the nature of the immediate relationship and perhaps the power or knowledge difference, and we put it into the other. So we're working from the same platform, and we're actually able to share on a much more human level. Ultimately, we are human beings who are given a challenge and a purpose in life, and that's our goal. So thank you for that question.
No worries. One last question before we run out of time. How do we take the power away from the small things? How do we stop that groupthink and drawing ourselves into those small things?
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Well, firstly, there are some very powerful and good small things. So we need to be able to firstly tell the difference between something that's going to lead to a virtuous cycle, and we don't want to take those away, and at the same time, those are actually going to lead to a vicious cycle. And part of that is that we need to be absolutely aware when we talk about those discriminatory details. We need to be at the absolute moment of our acute thinking and literally use our hunch model to figure this out. So if we see if we're in the middle of a drought and we see pieces of glass lying around, I mean, it ought to be your natural inclination to go and get that and take it away. I'm one of those people, if I'm out in our foyer and I see a piece of paper sitting there, or if I see something that's slipped on the wall or something, it's just in my nature to do something about it. I think, what could be the consequence of not doing this? So firstly, we want to be aware of what's cycle up and what's cycle down. And secondly, we just want to notice, what does this mean? What are the implications? And quite frankly, that just takes a minute. It takes seconds, in fact, milliseconds, to think that through. We work with this amazing person called Dr. Kathy C. And Kathy has this mantra of life's a choice. And in many of those moments, it is literally a choice for us to make a decision about what to do now. So we need the intelligence and the thinking models to be able to stop and think for a moment and then make a decision about what to do.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Peloso and QUT, for having us today for the CoveTalk. I'm sure everyone will agree there's lots of handy tips and tricks there that we can use in our everyday lives and indeed our workplace. If you're interested in exploring the theme of better thinking further, head on over to the Cove Plus on Adele and you can look through some of those modules that Dr. Peloso has created for us. Thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Peloso.
Captain Jenkins, thank you very much. Pleasure. Thank you.